All right, Matthew McConaughey. All right. Good morning, chapel people. Hello, my name is Trevor Skorburg. Oh, there it is. All right, lovely. Good morning. Welcome back. That's to me. You're saying that to me. Welcome back, Trevor. Thank you. Thank you. Jesus, have mercy. My name is Trevor Skorburg, and I'm beyond excited to be with you this morning, but I'm actually a little bit more excited that the fact that I got to run late to chapel, park in the chapel speaker parking spot, and campus safety has nothing on me. Welcome back. Welcome back. Dear Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart glorify and be honest to you. Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So when I was in high school, I had a friend. Just one. I really just had one, just one friend. So this friend of mine, though, he was just 3 years older than me, but the clear distinction between 13 and 16 is the ability to drive. So he would have to pick me up on several occasions because I didn't have my license yet. And he was a tall, lanky guy like myself, with a very kind heart. There was this one intersection we would commonly pass on our different routes, and I distinctly remember the very first time he nonchalantly gestured to the spot and shared that his friend had been killed by a drunk driver there. His friend was walking on the road, and the road takes a sharper turn, and the driver did not turn with the road, but rather turned life into death and stormed off the road onto the sidewalk and colliding with the boy. Again, I was younger. I was 13 years or so, and I'd only known this guy for a little while. So I didn't know what to say, and I thought to myself, what appears behind me is, how do I respond? How do I respond? And in that moment, I simply muttered out, and I'm sorry, before silence overtook the car. As we would pass by the spot, he would almost always share this information again and again, but never making a deliberate point to do so, but again would share it lightly, and gently, and casually. The reason I share this with you is how my response changed over time. As I matured and became closer with this guy, my silence and ineptitude slowly transformed into statements about how hard that must be, and eventually culminating in actually asking more about this event. Compassion entered the narrative. I began to care and cultivate this relationship by choosing to actively go through this experience with him, as on some level, compassion is really just a shared experience. And so when faced with a storm, with trouble or pain or confusion, whether that be your own or embarking on the journey with another, there's the option to sit idly by or to press on, to get up and to face it. And so today I want to tell you two stories about what all of this means, about the way of Jonah and the way of Jesus. The first is a passive response, and the second is an active response, a healthy correction. So Jonah was a prophet from the Old Testament, and if you, like me, slept through part of your way through the Intro to Old Testament class, you might need a refresher on Jonah, the prophet, who, as we will find out, really is no ordinary prophet. The opening chapter of this historic book, it plays upon our standards of what we might think a prophet to be: holy and connected to God, and vocal and assured of himself and their calling. But the first few sentences alone are a really fun exchange. It starts with God calling to Jonah, the work that God has prepared for Jonah to go and call out the city of Nineveh for their wickedness. And once God is finished telling Jonah what he is set to do, we don't jump to what Jonah said, but how Jonah responded. We didn't jump to how he said, "Here I am, O Lord, use me." But instead, God calls the man to action, and it says, "But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." Jonah eventually ended up on a ship trying to flee as far away as possible from God, and this is where we find Jonah and the crew of the ship. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea, and the ship threatened to break it up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down to the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so we do not perish." The sailors said to one another, "Come, let us each cast lots that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" "I am a Hebrew," he replied. "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you've done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them so. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men, the crew, feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. There was a movie that came out in the past year called Leave No Trace. It's a really pretty movie, and it tells the story of a father and his teenage daughter who choose to live off the land in a forest reserve outside of Portland and leave no trace and will be completely self-reliant. And I'm sorry to spoil it, but we find out that this dad is a veteran and is dealing out with some pretty harsh PTSD and uses the life in the forest as a kind of escape. After being discovered, the pair are forced to assimilate to the nearby town. The daughter begins to enjoy the more traditional lifestyle in a house with other people. But the heartbreaking end concludes with the father choosing to escape once more, back to the forest, away from the people, from the comfort of the city, back into the wilderness, and the daughter having to face the decision to carry on with her dad or to enter into society. She inevitably chooses the latter as she can no longer feed into the escapism. The final shot of the movie is of the father fading into the beautiful canvas of trees, fully separating himself from others and from healing once more. Anyone who really knows me knows I have a special place in my heart for movies, but there's always something about movies like this, movies that there's this idea, the fantasy of escaping, that I really enjoy. I, too, at times indulge in daydreams of what life would be like if I were to just drive west and escape into the mountains, to flee from all the storms of my life that sit before me. Whether that be the ever-growing mound of debt or relational issues with people around me so that I can just flee from people in general. And I know this feeling isn't unique to me either. I'm sure that there are times when you would rather avoid problems and instead bypass them and avoiding them for just long enough by pushing through them just long enough to outrun whatever it is we do not wish to confront. Jonah quite literally tries running away from everything. He's got a major assignment that he is procrastinating on, something I think we can all somehow relate to in one way or another. But Jonah tries to sleep it off instead of working on this assignment. And so first, the way of Jonah is the way of avoidance. I'll briefly mention, though, that there are times when we need to sleep as our bodies need it. This is self-care and not avoidance. So know your needs and meet them, but know that the way of Jonah is the way of avoidance. But let's quick turn to our second story. From the New Testament, Luke chapter 8, about the way of Jesus. One day Jesus, got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and waters, and they obey him?" There's a really interesting parallel going on here between our two main characters, between Jonah and Jesus. Both of our main characters find themselves first in a boat asleep. Jonah is anxiously trying to avoid what's in front of him. Jesus is truly resting. Secondly, a violent storm approaches. And third, then the crew of each ship comes to them, desperately looking for answers in a frenzy. But it's here that the story is split. There is the way of Jonah, and there is the way of Jesus. The way of Jonah breeds that escapism we talked about a couple of minutes ago, as after Jonah is interrogated by the crew, he hesitates to even share the whole story. In the face of confusion, Jonah is passive. His solution is not giving in to what God is calling him to, but rather continuing to flee and run and hide as he is tossed overboard. Beyond just us doing this with our assignments and schoolwork, this happens in some even more personal settings. Namely, in the spiritual places. The way of Jonah does not always have to be some bold, giant gesture of running away or escaping to the mountains of isolation. Avoidant tendencies can be far more subtle, especially in the Christian community. When I was young, my father's brother died. And at the funeral, in the midst of all the tears and open wounds that cancer leaves upon those who suffer with the suffering, I had the gall to turn to my father and in the form of some bad teenage spoken word poetic wisdom, said, "Just keep looking up, Dad." I thought that writing out the pain with all smiles was a good thing to do, and that this is what my Bible told me. I thought that this book taught me to rejoice in the Lord no matter what I was feeling, that everything happens for a reason, that anything and everything good in my life is a blessing from the Lord, and anything bad is just God cursing me. And so my father's response to my trite statement, a look of sorrow, and 3 words, "Not today, Trev. Not today, Trev." And so maybe you found yourself in a similar place with all the good intentions of the world, but you couldn't help but try to rid this other person of their sadness, whether that's because you think your Bible tells you so, or you're just uncomfortable with their pain, and you didn't know what to do with it. In a panic, you asked yourself, how do I respond, and didn't know what else to do but try and brush past it and bypass all the feelings and whatnot. Now, obviously, I was quite misinformed by my own interpretation and understanding of this beloved book, but there's actually a term for this. It's called spiritual bypassing. It's where spiritual practices or beliefs are used to avoid or bypass problematic topics or feelings or behaviors. One Psychology Today article put it this way: spiritual bypassing is a defense mechanism. Although the defense looks a lot prettier than other defenses, it serves the same purpose. Spiritual bypassing shields us from the truth. It disconnects us from our feelings and helps us to avoid the big picture. It is more about checking out than checking in. The difference is so subtle that we usually don't even know we are doing it. This is the way of Jonah. It is avoidance. Though it's gilded, covered with a shiny, pretty exterior, what we find inside is shame and fear and confusion running the process. This is what we find Jonah doing, and we see it in ourselves too, this drive to run away from where we are meant to be. It's the fear of what may come with it, the hardship and the suffering that we frankly don't want to face, the fear that if we call out the injustice in front of us, we might receive some backlash. And who can blame you or me or anyone? I mean, who really enjoys backlash? And what if it's the shame we find ourselves in? That we are not fit for what God has called us to. Who am I? Who am I to even call that person out for their pretty racist joke? I mean, I'm not even perfect either. I've said some dumb things before too, and how can I judge them and expect them to change if I haven't even dealt with all the stuff I've got going on? So with all these questions pulsing through our brains, we begin to sound a lot more like the crew of each ship, flustered at the first sign of trouble and unsure of what to do. And maybe that's who the way of Jonah is actually all about. Maybe it's less about these broad acts of defiance by one guy and more about the lot, the collective of us, who are more like a cluster of chickens with their heads cut off, running around in circles, not really knowing how to fix this stuff, pondering if there's even a way to, but who am I kidding? That's probably too much self-awareness to decapitate a chicken. My point is the way of Jonah. The avoidant tendencies we default into may be big or they may be small. But what makes fleeing so bad? I'm not literally running away on a boat. I'm fine. And there's some truth to that. Few, if any of us, can only really relate to those grand gestures of escapism like Jonah. I believe that leaves us relating more so to this crew, to this panicking collection of people at the core of it all, just trying to survive one step to the next, one assignment, 1 week, one step to the next. I believe we are the crew, scrambling towards the quick fix to deal with it as quickly as possible, even if that means just sweeping it under the rug for now. There's a quote from the book, The Road Back to You, that goes like this: "What we don't know about ourselves can and will hurt us, not to mention others, as long as we stay in the dark about how we see the world and the wounds and beliefs that have shaped who we are. We're prisoners of our own history. We'll continue going through life on autopilot, doing things that hurt and confuse ourselves and everyone around us." And so then there's these 2 camps that emerge out of this, these 2 camps of escapism. So one, there's those internal examples of avoidance, which we don't deal with our own stuff. We hide and escape from all of those feelings. We're just trying not to feel. But secondly, there's the external examples, whether they're coming as a ripple effect from the internal because it all seeps out into the other areas one way or another, or that you find yourself in a situation like I did where I had a friend experiencing something, and I want to avoid all those feelings and issues. These avoidant tendencies can be loud shouts of doubt, but they're more likely to be small whispers of despair. Bypassing around them may seem nice and pretty at first, but they're really just dead and rotting away inside. And so avoidance is ultimately harmful in how it pushes us to repeat the same harmful cycles we wish to end. And if we do not see the way these wounds of past and present affect us, they will not heal. If we do not approach the storms, the issues in front of us, they will only worsen as they just boil just beneath the surface. Avoidance keeps us prisoners of our own history. Avoidance keeps us scrambling inside the boats with storms fast approaching. So what do we do with all this? How do I respond? What do I do with all my shame and confusion and misunderstandings of spirituality? Instead of fleeing them and running away, we approach them. Jesus helps us to approach the issues we try to avoid. Jesus helps us approach the issues we try to avoid. The way of Jesus is approaching them. It's approaching these issues. It means not jumping overboard when it all hits the fan. Jesus gets up and gets to it. If there's a storm, he calms it. If there's shame or fear or confusion, there's grace. But let me be clear that the way of Jesus, following that, is not chaotically trying to solve all of our problems at once. Jesus helps us to approach them. Approach the issues we try to avoid. I really can't get over the parallel between these two stories that we find both Jonah and Jesus sleeping, of all things. Where Jonah is just trying to sleep it off, Jesus is resting. Jesus is content and right where he needs to be. There's such a sense of assurance between him and God. And it is this connection, this stabilized relationship between Son and Father that really presents the solution to these issues. Not one that overlooks the present condition, but one where Jesus, can be met with confusion from the crew, and instead of hesitating like Jonah did, stand up and without even so much as a word, as he literally says nothing and just acts, he approaches the storm and rebukes it. He censures it. He doesn't just passively wait for it to go. He actively gets up and stares the storm down. Now, he's able to do this, well, because he's Jesus. But again, the way of Jesus counters the escapist avoidance of the way of Jonah, and the confusion of the crew with a restful assurance and dependency on all of who God is. Jesus doesn't have to be afraid of approaching all that he approaches. When he walks into the markets and calls out the temple-goers for their obsession with money, or calls the Pharisees out for their cognitive dissonance between the holy things they say and the unholy things they do, he doesn't do it subtly. Jesus fearlessly approaches the injustice in front of him that he has been called to make right, which is what the Christian is also called to make right. The way of Jesus is not carefree, mindlessly going around correcting and nitpicking. It is first and foremost finding security in the grace of God and confronting our own fear and our own shame and our own confusion, and then, out of this rest in God, actively approaching the injustice in front of us, just as God has called us to do. But I didn't share these two stories and all this simply to point out that we're not being like Jesus, and we should. It's to point out that the fact that we're not, and in that, we can look to Jesus, not just as some lofty moral example of what do I do and just trying to loosely follow that, but also as the ones doing so on our behalf, as Jesus is doing all of this on our behalf. Jesus has the power to break through the storms. Jesus helps us to approach the issues we try to avoid for the sake of our own healing. Whether that be internally, like the shame, fear, or confusion that we secretly hold inside, or externally with the things that we embark on with others, we need healing that Jesus provides, so long as we let him. So long as we let compassion enter the narrative. So long as we stop trying to try so hard and to sleep with ease, knowing that God is present with us. Back in the boat, it is out of that deep slumber of serenity that Jesus awoke and approached the problem. So we too should enter into that rest and assurance with others and foremost with God as we approach the storms in life, with Jesus at our side rebuking the storm. Jesus is with us then, not to solve and make life perfect, but to aid us on this journey of truly approaching the shame, the fear, or the confusion that plagues us and those around us. On top of all of this, the way of Jesus gives us a true substantive satisfaction. Whether these storms we find throughout life are dealt with, they don't loom over us. They don't lurk just behind the corner. We don't have to be afraid of them or hold on to them or fall into the relentless, recurring process of shame and fear and confusion. Instead, these storms pass in due time. They grow less powerful and less violent. And we, in response, find freedom and hope in relying on all of who God is. And so as we close a little early, I want you to go into the remainder of your day and the remainder of your life and to see the two paths before you. To see first the way of Jonah and the way of avoidance, but then to see the way of Jesus, the way of approaching and confronting. I want you to meditate on the choices before you and meditate on these two thoughts. One, in what ways are you following the way of Jonah? How are you living out of shame or fear or confusion? In what ways are you following the way of Jonah? How are you living out of shame or fear or confusion? And secondly, how can you then follow the way of Jesus? Where do you need to rest in the grace of God and the assurance that that brings? And what storms do you need to approach as part of your own calling? How can you follow the way of Jesus? And so if you find yourself in a situation with another person, like myself in the car with a friend, as I ask myself, how do I respond to this grief or whatnot? Or if you need to learn how to respond to your own storms in life, I hope you can seek the way of Jesus and let compassion enter the narrative so you can boldly respond with God's grace and presence for your life and the lives of those around you, that you might see Jesus helps us approach the issues we try to avoid for the sake of our own healing. And so as you go, let me pray over you that may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor among you and grant you his peace. Amen. And you are dismissed.